Hello? Oh, I'm on. Okay. So we will crack on because everyone left, which is weird because there's wine afterwards. So usually you stay for the wine. And I was going to say we'll try to be fast, even though our predecessors and our professional, highly paid moderator went way over time. Your very poor, unprofessional moderator will try to do his best. So we're here to talk about the Transatlantic link. And those of us in diplomacy and academia all understand that when we talk about the Transatlantic link, of course, this is really code for relations between Brussels and obviously Ottawa. So I feel really privileged that I've been invited to talk about this. And you know, relations are fantastic. Latvia is home to the largest Canadian deployment anywhere in the world, 660 officers and soldiers working in 13 different locations, also in Estonia and Lithuania. Canada and Latvia signed a free trade agreement in 2017, 8% increase in trade over the 2 years. Latvia was the first country to sign it. And we even let Finland win the World Cup hockey last year. So I think the Europe-Canada portion is doing really, really well. It occurs to me that there might be some other opinions on some of the other capitals. And so without further ado, I would like to invite up some of my partners. The first is Ambassador Deborah McCarthy. Deborah McCarthy is the visiting fellow at the Finnish Institute of Foreign Affairs, and she's the former US ambassador to Lithuania. Deborah, please come and join us. Our second guest is Dr. Christian Mölling, who's the research director at the German Council on Foreign Relations. Christian has work experience in Zurich, Paris, Brussels, London, and, well, in Berlin, obviously.
Yeah. Should sit.
Next, Mr. Eric Pavel, who's from the NATO Public,
the
NATO Public Diplomacy Division. Eric is responsible for information programs in the 3 Baltic states, as well as in Germany, Belgium, the Netherlands, and is still working on issues in Afghanistan. Eric, welcome.
Thanks.
And finally, from Warsaw, Dr. Patricia Sosnal, who is head of research at the Polish Institute of International Affairs. She's also a 2010 Fulbright scholar, so has work transatlantic. And I meant to say that Deborah was the U.S. Consul General in Montreal, so also has work North America, I don't know if we say that. But
where all the positive news comes from.
So, and I think you'll also notice we have excellent ballots of academics, of practitioners, of North Americans, of Europeans, and very importantly, perfect gender balance. So welcome. I don't count.
Not so perfect.
So let's crack on. Deborah, I don't know. I mean, what's going on in Washington? Nothing interesting, I guess, but.
I am trying to keep up with the tweets, but mostly maintaining contact with my diplomatic colleagues to get a temperature of where our policies are going.
So I'm going to lead you a little bit more because I think as we establish the Canadian portion of the transatlantic piece is working pretty smoothly. How's the rest of it working?
Well, with regards to our transatlantic, I want to start out with some good news, which is they just recently did a poll by the Chicago Council, a poll they've done for the last 45 years. 7 out of 10 of Americans believe we should be engaged in the world. So for those and a lot of foreign policy circles that believe that we are retrenching, that is not the case. Also the good news, and I'll start with good news, the good news is that over approximately 77% also believe that NATO is important to U.S. security. And last but not least, they asked this year in the survey, should U.S. troops be used in the defense of a NATO ally, specifically referring to the Baltics? And the answer was yes, in a majority. The other piece of good news, I think, and something we forget about in the fog of war and tweets, is our tight investment relationship, because our transatlantic bonds on the economic side are not about trade, but it's about investment. 60% of our investment is in Europe. 68% of Europe's investment is in the United States. Most of the data flowing across the world comes from the transatlantic. But then there's not such good news. When you look at our national security strategy, the current administration has adopted an approach, a belief, a fundamental belief, that we have entered a competitive era. So they have moved most of the foreign policy establishment to a competitive, confrontational approach. And most importantly, and I think this is something that people have to recognize, they have abandoned the long-held model since World War II of U.S. diplomacy that we could get our foes and rivals, Russia, China, to adopt Western norms and rules. They have abandoned that effort and moved to coercive use of foreign policy tools, which I can get into.
Thank
So I'll
you.
do that as a temperature test.
I want to draw your collective attention to what's going on behind you because I was just caught off guard by it. So I don't think it's been hijacked. This is supposed to happen, right? Okay, cool. So those are maybe the stars and there'll be stripes. I'm not sure. Anyway, so that'll be fun. Christian, your perspective from Berlin. Obviously, the German-American relationship is fundamental. Germany is the largest single trading partner in the EU with the United States. We're talking very much about the now because the now is in the headlines all the time because how can it not be? What do you see going forward?
Yeah, I think it's a key point to recognize that over the last years, I guess we're a little bit caged in the presentism of things that we say. So currently the situation is bad. We're not looking into the future. I think the future from a not necessarily Berlin perspective, but from a European perspective, doesn't need to be possibly that bad if we start thinking about how could we basically influence the current situation or the future situation better than we do for the moment. So I guess the first issue is stop complaining about it and see as to what extent the current policies, which are to a certain extent difficult to identify in Washington, are nonetheless helpful for the Europeans. And if there is an opportunity to either jump on them or to even trigger them into a direction that is helpful for those European interests we may even share with the US. That's the one hand. The second thing is, I have the impression that maybe not in the White House, but in other corners of Washington, there is a growing understanding that if China is the main concern of Washington, then the EU and Europe are major allies in this fight. And the opposite, a weak European Union and a weak Europe, is a major problem for the US, because it would basically create Europe as a battlefield, not militarily, but economically, between China and the US. So I guess here it's the job of the Europeans to make clear that they are of a significant value, even in a transactional relationship, towards the US. And I guess from that point of view, even if the structural perspective is it will never be the same as it has been, I mean, that's kind of a truism, I guess there are at least opportunities that we shouldn't miss to get an influence on this, because I guess at the same time what the Europeans think, not the Europeans, but at least in Berlin, I have the impression the thinking is that this president is in for another round. So nobody is really betting on a next democratic president, although everybody's hoping on it. I think there is a realism, or maybe you could call it a hyper-realism, that this guy will be there, and that because of that, nothing will be a honeymoon in 2 years' time from now.
Thanks. Eric, the Secretary General, your big boss, was in Washington in April. He gave what was largely considered to be an exceptional speech to the Congress, numerous standing ovations. How is he managing the relationship? What is the feeling from NATO headquarters? Deborah mentioned also that in headlines like this, we are painting a rather grim picture, but is it actually that grim? The polling is very positive. The Secretary General's reception in Congress was exceptionally positive.
Yeah, thanks for inviting me here and being able to also help organize this event, which I think is really well done. So congratulations to Andres and your team. Looking from the Brussels perspective, it is important to have these conversations. I mean, previous panel with from the Russian angle, of course, is really helpful. Now, how we see things from Brussels, of course, and you mentioned my boss, the Secretary General, I think he's being recognized as doing a pretty good job in not easy times for any SecGen, because his main job is, of course, to keep the alliance together and cohesion and unity strong. And I think he's widely recognized of having managed to do this. You may know that recently his term was extended until September 2022, so he will be one of the longest serving SecGens in NATO history, because he started in 2014. If he goes to 2022, that's 8 years. I think that's recognition by the allies of his good job in keeping the alliance together. Because if you look at everything that's happening around us, and a lot of the things that I wanted to say were actually already said this morning by James and Heiner. But if you look at the security environment around us, and if you look at history, 40 years we did just collective defense. After 1990, we started focusing on crisis management, operations, peacekeeping in the Balkans, Afghanistan. We more or less forgot collective defense. Then 9/11, went to Afghanistan. And then, of course, the other main breaking point in history, 2014, Russian annexation of Crimea and in Ukraine. Which means for the first time in our existence, we have to focus on multiple different kind of threats at the same time. We've always had the luxury to mainly focus on one. Collective defense, then mainly crisis management, forgetting Article 5, and now we have to do it all. We have to do again Article 5 kind of things. We have to focus on the terrorist threat. We have to look at the whole new range of security threats. It was mentioned today, cyber warfare, hybrid, which of course in itself is quite a challenge for a classical military alliance, how to deal with hybrid, which of course has a lot of civilian elements in it. So I think to keep the nations all on board, and it was mentioned this morning, the 360-degree approach, we have to take the different interests from the northern countries, the southern, the west, and the east, all into account as NATO. And I think, the opinion poll, I also mentioned the Chicago Council, it's quite amazing, I think. Even from the Republicans, 62% says that NATO is essential for US security. And apparently this is an historical high percentage that they mentioned. I also want to refer to the latest Pew Research poll we did in the run-up to the NATO summit, and also mainly focusing on Canadian and European viewpoints. I think there are also different levels of support, but overall I think the median was about 61%. And I still think in today's world of disinformation, propaganda, lack of trust in politics, I think that is quite a remarkable high level of public support still on both sides of the ocean, but also on both sides of the political aisles.
Thank you, Eric. Patricia, welcome. Poland is arguably doing an exceptional job in managing its relationship with Washington. Poland also just hosted, of course, the president of Latvia. We're talking about, the whole title of this is a relationship in flux, security, or very cleverly, insecurity. But is this anything new? Is this, in fact, a big change on the history of the development and the evolution of the NATO relationship anyways?
Yeah, so for a long time I thought that this was a historical low between Europe and the United States, because Trump redefined the meaning of the word alliance. I will get back to that later. But then I found consolation in literature. Let me quote to you one sentence from a novel by Joseph Conrad, a Polish Brit. He wrote Nostromo in 1904. Okay? It's a novel about a fictional Latin American country. And there he writes the following sentence. Government in general, any government, anywhere, is a thing of exquisite comicality to a discerning mind. And I thought, we all have discerning minds. It's fine that I see comicality in some governments. But then perhaps, if he wrote it in 1904, then it's nothing new. Not a bad thing will come out of this, that we can overcome the problems that are there. And I thought I should maybe look at the Trump administration as something, as a bit of a chance, as an opportunity. And I think what Trump gives us Europeans, is he allowed us to see things clearly. He allowed us to, what was there. We were lazy, we were perhaps lenient, we didn't know where we absolutely need the United States and where we should think of increasing our own capacities. Now it becomes more clear. We see the world as it is, perhaps more clearly. So I found this good point in the current conflict, if I may say so, in the transatlantic relations. And transatlantic relations are much more than just NATO. I mean, the first panel was, I should say, very self-satisfactory in saying that deeds, actions speak louder than words. Well, I'm afraid words speak loud too. I mean, especially in our communication-driven world of today. What you say really bears on perceptions of Europeans. Europeans become more and more anti-American. I mean, later on, you will have societies that weigh on their governments, that demand something of their governments, And then the governments will have to respond to that. So I think there's an interplay between words and deeds. It's just much deeper than just actions speaking louder than words. My second point is about the importance of transatlantic relations when it comes to the challenges of today. And a lot has been said about the revisionist policies of Russia, about the rising China, but then very little's been said about the need for a concerted action across the Atlantic when it comes to irregular migration and when it comes to climate change. Now, for a long time, whenever there was an issue and there was a transatlantic unity on it, people were convinced that there's a sense of urgency, that it truly is an important thing. Now, when these divisions come up across the Atlantic, I think people might be thinking that perhaps climate change is not that important. Perhaps, irregular migration, you can just stop people and that'll be it. No, we will have more and more of this. We will have more climate refugees. Now, without this, and I dare to say somehow moral leadership of the transatlantic community on these issues, they will not be tackled. And we will have much more of the problems that we dare not to speak about today. So maybe a word about the defense expenditure in Europe. I think it's a fictional discussion. It's a fictional argument to be saying that Europe needs to spend more on its defense, but at the same time should not integrate its defense capabilities. I mean, the two can go hand in hand. Spending more means increasing European defense capabilities, which is in the US interest, is it not? And is in the transatlantic interest. So I just want to say that the EU Commission has just proposed a tenfold increase in the budget for EU defense and external security, 22.5 billion euros. That may not sound that much, but it's a tenfold increase for the years 2021, 2027. We have PESCO, we have European Defense Fund, and I think the US should be happy about it. And Poland is participating in it. So I think what's important maybe to finish with is this notion of an alliance. Sorry if I'm speaking too long, I mean, relatively to your introductions. But I always thought, and Andris mentioned that in the beginning, Andris, you said one for all and all for one, right? Is this a material meaning of the word alliance? I mean, can you pay to your allies to behave like this? Or there's something more to it that needs to be there? I think there's something more that needs to be there. Values need to be there. Some kind of morality, someone said, would not moralize here, but some kind of morality meaning responsibility for the world order, responsibility for peace. This is what transatlantic relations are about too. And I think this is maybe slightly missing from what we're seeing now. I hope it will be back to what it was, but we need to think about that. So I will also finish with a quote, again from Nostromo. Sorry to be making this literary incursions, but I think there's a lot in literature to learn in politics from. So there is no peace and no rest in the development of material interests. They have their law and their justice, but it is founded on expediency and is inhuman. It is without rectitude, without the continuity and the force that can be found only in a moral principle. And I think this is what transatlantic relations should also be about, not only about material interests.
Thank you. You mentioned the first panel, and let me bring it back to the first panel, and in fact, our opening speaker, the president, and he noted, and the very theme of this brings up the idea, is the relationship in flux? Is it a security relationship or an insecurity relationship? So we're questioning it. That's the very reason that we're all on stage today. But then this morning, James and both Henrik said, despite those who say there are challenges, there are issues, it's in flux, financial support has increased. The deployment of troops, not just American, but Canadian as well, has increased substantially. And actually, things are better now than they were in 2016. So, Deborah, what do you think?
I think we need to focus on some of the negatives. I started out with the positives, threw in a little bit of the negative of the change in the strategic framework. But there's another negative, which is across the transatlantic, we also have differing views on the tools of foreign policy. The current Trump administration believes in using coercive tools in support of its new strategic framework. Tariffs, sanctions, blockages, you name it. Interestingly enough, the United States, and I ran the sanctions team, learned how to use sanctions after we worked together on Iran before the JCPOA, and as we worked together vis-à-vis Russia. And we became very good at it. But we are using a number of the sanctions with no end goal in sight. There is no enunciated goal for the sanctions on Iran. It keeps moving. On tariffs, ditto. We are using tariffs to right a trade balance, forgetting the fundamentals of who holds our deficit, which is China, 37%, and the flows of the investment funds, which I mentioned earlier. So that is where we have disconnects on the tools. That is not to say we don't agree with the tools on occasion. When we did our joint strike in Syria after their use of chemical weapons, that was not controversial. When Cybercom, using its new authorities, has hit into Russia, although it's not confirmed, I don't think there's a lot of dissension on that. So certain tools on the military side, but in general, the use of coercive tools rather than diplomacy and negotiations, with a couple of exceptions. They're trying on Korea, trying on Taliban. There's a dissonance with Europe on that.
Christian, relationship in flux or much ado about nothing?
Say again the second part?
Much ado about nothing. I can quote too. I mean,
Wow.
Yeah.
And already Shakespeare.
I have no quote, but it's let's try to kind of do what we all fear about, to decouple what is happening in the US from what is happening in Europe. Because I mean, at the end of the day, I think basically there's a good way of looking only to the Europeans and not only always to what the US does. Because at the end of the day, either with the US or alone, we basically have to do more for our security. That's basically, however, the way you turn it, the result is always the same. It's us who have to do more, either together with the US or alone. If it is alone, then of course it's a completely different game, but nonetheless, to keep the US on board, at least we have to throw some more things into the game, and I think there are some helpful tools that you have mentioned, which don't kind of, tip the balance for the moment, I guess, but I agree fully that the US should not be afraid of this. But this is also kind of a historical kind of pattern that we have, that unfortunately, whenever after the end of Cold War, the Europeans got closer to each other, not integrated, but cooperated more intensively, the Americans got nervous about these things. That is the result, that was the reason why we had Madeleine Albright's 3Ds, which was actually not about the Europeans cooperating, but especially the Brits and the French saying that they want to cooperate closer, and by that opening the door to the rest of cooperation in Europe. That is 20 years ago. And we basically have a kind of resemblance of the same situation where the Europeans are looking for more Europeanness within NATO, with more contribution from the European Union. What was 20 years ago called the European Security and Defense Identity. And that is coming back. So the same discussions that we have today, we basically had 20 years ago. It was a kind of the same situation with regard to the alliance and the question of what Europe does here. And this even reaches back much further to the end of the Second World War, where the solution to how do we organize security in Europe after hundreds of years of fighting war to each other was NATO. So that was the kind of the one solution that we had at that time for 50, 70 years. And now we currently have a second framework in which we could possibly organize security. But NATO at that time, at the end of the Second World War, wasn't kind of, that was not 100 or a wholehearted decision by every member. Especially the French have always been cautious about NATO. They even left parts of NATO for the reason that...
But came back.
And came back, yeah, a honeymoon that you had at the time. I'm not sure how they think about this today, but that's something we can discuss later.
It's like a wine conversation.
Yeah. So I guess what we currently see is a situation where we are soul searching as the Europeans of what our role is in NATO and what the European Union can contribute to it. The second point is what we have learned over the last 2 years in the discussion of European autonomy, I guess, is this doesn't lead us anywhere if the European Union tries to do something on its own in the area of security and defense, or at least in the area of defense. And I guess we can take it from there for the next European Commission and for many governments in Europe that there may be a more realistic outlook for the next years.
And Eric, what's the view from headquarters? Is it, doom and gloom, fire and brimstone, or actually there's quite a silver lining on all
Doom and gloom. We're having an anniversary year this year. We have celebrations. We have reason to celebrate 70 years of peace, unprecedented in European history. I think we have some right to be proud. No, come on. We are a democracy of alliances. I mean, 20 different nations. Of course, there are different viewpoints around the table. It was mentioned this morning as well. We've had major political disagreements in the past. Remember Iraq? I was there already in NATO headquarters 2003. That was a major split in the alliance, a major split in the European Union. So we've been there before. I'm Dutch. We've had this cruise missile debate in the 80s. It was massive, mass movements against NATO's policy. So there's nothing new there about disagreement. But I think the key point is, and also the Secretary made this point in April for the US Congress, we've always been able to unite about our core task,
Brilliant.
which is collective defense, Article 5. That's where we can unite. And of course, we have an interest in keeping as much as possible all these bilateral or problems in the EU or wherever about Iran. We don't have a stake in, of course, we have a stake in Iran, but it's not regularly discussed. It's not one of our main tasks. Climate change, of course, it has security implications. We're looking at it, but we try to keep it as much as possible outside the building because we need to focus on our core task. And, we are a purely intergovernmental organization. We need consensus for everything. So, yeah, that is a very important feature for our organization to keep as much as possible the unity there. And again, if you look at the public support, I mean, you say, yes, of course, and I think people can distinguish between President Trump and the US. If you look at opinion polls, it's still remarkably high. We are now third year in the Trump presidency. You could say, well, NATO would also suffer equally from the bad reputation of Trump in European opinion polls. I see them in Germany as well. 5% of the Germans has trust in President Trump. Why doesn't that translate into opinion pollings on NATO up to this very day? I still very remarkable that people can still rely on what NATO is as an alliance, what it's trying to do, and actually we need the unity in order to be able to be credible. And if you talk about deterrence, particularly here in Latvia, that's of course fundamentally important. Maybe my last point about NATO-EU, as it was also mentioned, and I noticed there was a recent speech also by the US Secretary of Defense, Mark Esper. He was in London 2 weeks ago. And he also reiterated again the point saying, also referring to this recent decision by the US to cut some of the military investments in Europe and in other parts. And he said, yes, but it's also what we expect from the Europeans. We've been saying, we take this very seriously. James said it this morning. The Americans are very serious about the 2%. They really mean it now. And, if the Europeans are concerned about the US now no longer are investing massively as much as until recently also in this region, well, if the Europeans would step up and all reach the 2% in the next few years, it would help alleviating some of these gaps, but it would also help alleviate President Trump's main complaint when he meets his counterparts. I'm sure in London he's going to raise it again, the burden sharing, they're not paying enough. If the Europeans would step up and really put their money where their mouth is, they decided to do it, it would help also alleviate President Trump's complaints and therefore improve the transatlantic relationship.
Yeah, thanks, Patricia, same question to you very quickly, though, and then we'll turn to the audience, I think, for one fast round so that we can wrap up on time.
Sure. I will take the liberty of only slightly disagreeing with
Absolutely.
you, sir. On NATO and the perception of NATO. of course, it goes without saying that there's still good perception of NATO, but NATO is not understood, I bet, as the United States. It's an allied effort. Maybe some people do see it as a US project, but I think it's seen as a joint allied effort. So I would not expect a drop in popularity of NATO, also because there are significant challenges around Europe. So out of probably the 3 geographical points of greatest danger in the world today, which is Far East, Korean Peninsula, South China Sea, the Middle East, and I dare to say Russia, the 2 are in Europe's nearest vicinity. So the fear of people and belief in NATO, I think, is understandable. But it may not have much to do with Trump, vice versa, actually. Now, when it comes to Iraq, in 2003, the situation was slightly different. It was a conflict about one geographical location, about one war, about Iraq. Many countries were not in European Union back then, including Poland. And I think in comparison with the plethora of conflicts and contentious issues that we have now on our plate in transatlantic relations, these situations may not be that comparable. And finally, also to Christian, I would be a little bit hesitant to say that there is a second or a unique framework for European security. No, I think in security terms, we really are in this transatlantic endeavor for the time being, and it will not change. It can be compatible, not duplicating NATO structures or capabilities. I just think that Europeans expect a stronger, I don't think that, I see that in the polls, expect a stronger European role played outside of Europe, and for that we need to increase our defense capabilities, but together with the United States and in compatibility with NATO. NATO summit in Warsaw showed that with the NATO-EU agreement. NATO is on board when it comes to PESCO. So I think there's a lot of common interest at play here without thinking about any independent structures.
Thank you. So if we can turn to our audience, and keeping in mind that we're supposed to be done right now, and again, I don't know if I mentioned, but wine is waiting. So we'll do a quick round of a few colleagues. You can pick what you want to answer. We'll go through those, and then I'll turn it back over to the organizers. So very quickly, are there any questions? Oh, one, yes. Sorry. It is insanely hot up here. You have no idea.
Exactly.
Carlos Bukovskis, Latvian Institute of National Affairs. I actually was listening. Thank you very much for your presentations. That was excellent. And I was actually wondering, especially when you mentioned that, 2003, there was also the moment of discord in relations between the European and US partners. So I was just actually wondering at one point, isn't it a bit of a situation that this is the old story, and going back to the quotations and everything else, the old story of Europe from Venus and then the US from Mars? And isn't it also a bit related with the fact that if the Republican administration, then the relations with Europe are a bit tricky just because the Republicans are more hawkish. When the Democrats are in power, then the relationships immediately improve. Thank you.
Thank you. I think we've got one behind you.
Yes, hello, Ian Anthony from CIPRI. I just wanted to press a bit on the idea of the utility of structures for Europe to organize military activities to a certain extent with a degree of autonomy. In the 1980s, the Western European Union was able to organize the protection of European commercial shipping in the Gulf in a very dangerous threat environment where Iraq was using advanced weapons. Now, when the question is put to European countries, could you take more responsibility for protection of your own commercial shipping? The European Union seems to regard this as a strange question. Why would people be asking us? So I would say we've significantly degraded our capacity to operate in our own interests. The European Union has simply not developed the structures to do this. So is it really the case that we can afford to continuously look away from the need for some form of more autonomous organization at a European level? the kinds of things that President Macron has been talking about are at least reminiscent of the Western European Union, which post-Brexit will need some kind of organization for discussing this in a European context. So I just wanted to push a little bit on whether we need some form of organization for European action.
Thank you, and we'll take one more if we have, yeah.
It's more a comment with a question mark. I find it very,
So
very
just a comment, really.
discomforting that, when you look at the Gulf crisis, it is very difficult for some Europeans to cooperate with their strongest ally in an area that is so important to them. It is very discomforting for me to see that asking for higher defense spending in Germany is impeded by Trump's pressure. So it's easy for the critics in Germany to say, we can't be Trump's poodle. So in the end, a more friendly policy from Washington would make it much more easier for us to bring forward the transatlantic relations as we need it.
All right, keeping in mind that two of you have flights to catch, let's just go in order, pick what you want to answer, we'll wrap up. And I thought the Venus and the Mars thing would have been a clever cartoon, but that's fine.
We
All
could
right,
have done
Deborah,
that.
yeah.
A couple of comments. One, this is not the past. Fundamentally, because of three major things, but there are more to add, which is the rise of China will change our relationship. And the rise is not all negative. Two, cyber. Cyber on the civilian side, cyber on the military side. And with regards to that one, the fact that our cyber command has new offensive capabilities which it is using, it is going to use it and disrupt things in Europe, and we do not have a civilian dialogue on that aspect. That is a new element in our relationship. And last but not least is information warfare, malign foreign influence, disinformation. This is where I think new channels can be opened up. The European Union is far ahead of the United States on the issue of disinformation. There's a strategy, there's a code of conduct. In the United States, we have no such thing. The Department of State is in charge of disinformation overseas with 75 people and $40 million. Our military capability is vast but doesn't have certain authorities. There is no trust between our government and our social media companies, let alone a code of conduct. So that's another element. So I don't see it a return from the past. On the famous issue of 2%, having spent over 20 years in Europe talking about 2%, it's been a long-standing discussion. I think we need to have a more sophisticated discussion, which many, many fora attempt to do. And I think that in the, even in the polling that took place in the United States, they're not worried about 2%. They aren't. They are more concerned about overall security, with the highest concern being having a strategic alliance with Europe, in particular with NATO, to focus on these new challenges, and that's the most important thing to remember.
All right, thank you. Christian, final comments.
Yeah. Maybe I start with the 2%. I think there is, picking up on what also Henning has said, there is a lot of room of maneuver between the current spending levels that we have, which are resembling European free riding on American capabilities, and spending the full 2% just for spending the 2%. Because I do not agree that more spending basically generates more capabilities. We have tremendous examples where this is not the case, where this is just burning money. So it's about also clever spending on these things. So that's on the, I guess, on the first part. And on the second part, I think the future is to a certain extent the past. The European Union will not be any kind of a defense framework in terms of an operational framework. That's not available. Also because you would have to have the consensus on all these things. I guess what Macron has done is a way of organizing a coalition of the willing, call it European Intervention Initiative, what you want. It's a reaction to that, which is in complete French interest, and I can completely understand it, and it may be helpful to have such a thing, and if it can be used at the end of the day. So I think nonetheless, the role of the European Union for security and defense will be essential. Because one is, it is a defense facilitator that NATO can never be, in terms of helping on procurement projects, helping on R&D, which otherwise smaller countries would not be able to make any kind of punch on these and cannot participate in development. So it's important to keep the smallest engaged. And everything that is not conventional kinetic, so everything from, I don't know what you all call hybrid or foreign influence, whatever, is the European Union or its member states' responsibility, because that's about public administration, that's about police, that's about water purification, that's about civilian standards, which are not set by NATO, but they are set by law, by European law, by Brussels, and which are tremendously helpful also for NATO and for every member state to have these things. So therefore, I think the only thing I can complain about is politics coming in the way of the brilliant, already established work sharing in principle that we have. If only the suspicion wouldn't come to all these things, I think it would work much more brilliantly as it does today.
Brilliant. Thank you, Christian. Eric, 2 minutes, final comments?
Yeah, the example,
comments,
the example of Iraq I just mentioned, not to compare it with now. I take it it's a totally different environment. It was a different dispute, but just to show that we have had internal debates and disputes in as long as we exist. Nothing wrong there, nothing new there. On the 2%, as I said, it would help extremely to improve the transatlantic relationship. And I mean, and if you look at the threat environment we're in, I mean, as I said, we have to deal for the first time actually simultaneously with classical collective defense, crisis management, counterterrorism, and the whole new challenges of new technology, the disruptiveness. So the extra investments that we hope all allies will do, 2% by 2024, would also help in meeting all these new challenges and at the same time. So it cuts both ways in a sense. That's it.
Thank you, sir.
So the only question that is left without answer is the one about Democrats and Republicans, so I'll take that one. I think a lot has changed now since 2017 because of the divisiveness of the Trump administration, I think. Many issues, if not most, have become issues of division within the United States. So if you could think, I guess, could have thought before Trump came into office that Republicans and Democrats were more or less on the same page when it comes to Europe, maybe Republicans with a slightly different idea, but there was thinking about Europe for sure on both sides of the aisle. These days, the question of relations with Europe is the question of political division in the United States, and I think it's dangerous. It's dangerous because there's always a shift in power, right? Democrats come after Republicans and Republicans after Democrats. You can see this division playing out incredibly when it comes to Israel. Israel, for the first time, I think, in American history, has become an issue of political division. Because of the policies of this administration when it comes to Israeli-Palestinian conflict and Israel, actually. So I think there is much more division when it comes to American foreign policy between Democrats and Republicans, and it's not conducive to European interests.
Thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, only slightly off schedule now. That is your panel. Please give them a huge round of applause.